The helicopter's rotors cut through the thick Afghan air as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos checked her equipment one final time. The mission briefing had been clear: extract valuable intelligence from a compound deep in Taliban territory. Get out clean. What they hadn't mentioned was that this would be her first operation since returning from medical leave. 3 months earlier, an IED had nearly ended her military career. The explosion that killed 2 of her team members had left her with a shattered left leg and enough psychological scars to fill a medical textbook. But Maria Santos wasn't the type to stay down. Physical therapy had been hell, but the mental rehabilitation had been worse. Every night, she relived the moment when Corporal Jenkins stepped on that pressure plate, the flash of light that changed everything. Now, strapped into the Black Hawk with Alpha Team, she focused on the mission ahead. The intelligence they needed was crucial for upcoming operations in the region. A high-value target had been using the compound as a communications hub, and the data stored there could save hundreds of American lives. Captain Rodriguez, the team leader, gave final instructions over the intercom. Remember, we go in silent, grab the intel, and extract. Estimated time on ground is 30 minutes maximum. Santos, you're on tech duty. Get those hard drives and any communication equipment you can carry. Maria nodded, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had trained for this moment, pushing through months of doubt and physical pain. The medical board had cleared her for active duty just 2 weeks ago, but she knew some of her teammates still questioned whether she was ready. Sergeant First Class Thompson, sitting across from her, had made his feelings clear during pre-mission planning. Nothing personal, Santos, but you've been out of the game for months. This isn't the place to shake off rust. His words stung because part of her wondered if he was right. The compound appeared below them, a collection of mud brick buildings surrounded by high walls. Intelligence reports indicated minimal security, but Maria knew better than to trust completely in reconnaissance. The Taliban had proven remarkably adaptive, and what looked empty from satellite imagery could be crawling with fighters on the ground. As the helicopter descended, Maria ran through her mental checklist. She had studied the compound's layout until she could navigate it blindfolded. The communications room was located in the main building's southwest corner, accessible through either the front entrance or a rear window. Her backup plan involved 3 different extraction routes, each memorized down to the number of steps between cover points. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Alpha Team moved with practiced precision, each member following predetermined routes toward their assigned objectives. Maria's destination was the communications room, where she would have approximately 15 minutes to gather intelligence before the team began extraction procedures. The compound seemed deserted as they approached the main building. Too quiet, Maria thought, her training kicking in. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was wrong. But the mission parameters were clear, and the intelligence was too valuable to abandon based on gut feelings. Thompson took point as they entered the building, his rifle sweeping left and right. The interior matched the reconnaissance photos. Narrow hallways, multiple rooms branching off a central corridor. The communications room should be just ahead, around the next corner. That's when they heard the first shots. The sound came from outside, rapid bursts of automatic weapons fire. Thompson immediately signaled for the team to take defensive positions. Through his radio, Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled with tension. Alpha Team, we have multiple contacts approaching from the north and east. This was a setup. Prepare for immediate extraction. Maria's blood ran cold. They had walked into a trap. The intelligence that had seemed so reliable, the reconnaissance that showed minimal security, it had all been fabricated. Someone had fed them false information, and now they were surrounded in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no immediate backup. Through the window, Maria could see muzzle flashes in the darkness. The Taliban had positioned fighters in the surrounding buildings, creating a crossfire that would make reaching the extraction point nearly impossible. The helicopter that had brought them was already taking fire, its pilot struggling to maintain position while providing covering fire with the door gunner. "Santos, forget the intel," Thompson shouted over the increasing gunfire. "We need to get out of here now." But as they prepared to withdraw, an explosion rocked the building. The blast came from the rear of the compound, where their primary extraction route was located. Secondary explosions followed, suggesting the Taliban had planted charges along all their planned escape routes. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through their radios again, but this time it carried devastating news. "Alpha Team, the LZ is compromised. We're taking heavy fire and have multiple casualties. The bird is going down. Repeat, the bird is going down." Through the chaos, Maria watched their helicopter struggling to maintain altitude. Smoke poured from its engine compartment, and she could see the pilot fighting to control the aircraft. The door gunner continued firing even as the helicopter began its emergency landing sequence, trying to reach a safe zone outside the immediate combat area. The reality of their situation hit like a physical blow. They were trapped in enemy territory with no immediate extraction available. The nearest friendly forces were miles away, and their radio communications were being jammed by sophisticated equipment that suggested this operation had been planned well in advance. Thompson made the tactical decision that would haunt them all. "We split up. Better chance of survival if we don't stay grouped. Santos, you take the east route. We'll rendezvous at Checkpoint Alpha in 6 hours." Maria wanted to argue, to insist they stay together, but she knew he was right. A single group would be easier to track and eliminate. By splitting up, they increased the odds that someone would survive to report what had happened. As gunfire intensified around the compound, each team member began moving toward their assigned escape routes. Maria gathered her essential equipment and prepared to leave the building through the rear window. Her injured leg throbbed with each step, but she pushed through the pain. The last thing she heard before going solo was Thompson's voice on the radio. "Remember your training. Stay low, move fast, and trust no one. We'll see each other on the other side." But as Maria slipped through the window into the hostile darkness beyond, she couldn't shake the feeling that she would never see any of them again. The enemy had planned this ambush too carefully, and they clearly had inside information about American operations. Someone had betrayed them, and now she was alone in enemy territory with nowhere to run. The compound erupted in flames behind her as she moved through the shadows. The Taliban had succeeded in their trap, and now the real battle for survival was just beginning. Maria Santos had trained for many scenarios, but being abandoned behind enemy lines had never been part of any exercise. She checked her watch. 0247 hours. 6 hours until the rendezvous point. If she could survive that long, and if any of her teammates were still alive, they might have a chance. But first, she had to disappear into a landscape where every face was potentially hostile and every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. The mountains loomed ahead, offering both shelter and danger. Taliban fighters knew this terrain intimately, while she was operating from satellite maps and brief reconnaissance reports. Every step away from the compound took her deeper into unknown territory, but staying near the burning buildings meant certain capture or death. As she moved through the darkness, Maria began to understand the true scope of their situation. This hadn't been a random ambush or fortunate Taliban positioning. The level of coordination, the sophisticated jamming equipment, the precise timing of the explosions, it all pointed to something much larger than a simple intelligence gathering mission gone wrong. Someone with access to classified mission parameters had provided the enemy with detailed information about their operation. The question was whether that betrayal extended to their extraction protocols and rendezvous points. If the Taliban knew about Checkpoint Alpha, her teammates would be walking into another trap. But communication was impossible with their radios jammed, and she had no way to warn them. Her only option was to reach the rendezvous point and hope her training and instincts would be enough to detect any signs of enemy presence. The reality of her situation settled over her like a cold blanket. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, barely 3 months recovered from devastating injuries, was alone in enemy territory with limited ammunition, compromised communications, and no clear path to friendly forces. The Taliban fighters searching for her had every advantage: local knowledge, superior numbers, and apparently inside information about American operational procedures. They also had time on their side. Dawn would break in a few hours, eliminating the cover of darkness that was currently her only protection. As she picked her way through the rocky terrain, Maria focused on the survival training that had been drilled into every special operations soldier. Water was her first priority. She carried enough for perhaps 18 hours. Food could wait, but shelter would become critical once daylight exposed her position. Most importantly, she needed to assume that all normal protocols had been compromised. The rendezvous point, extraction procedures, even emergency communications frequencies might be known to the enemy. Survival would depend on thinking beyond standard operating procedures and trusting her own judgment over established protocols. The distant sound of helicopter rotors caught her attention. For a moment, hope flared that rescue was already on the way. But the sound pattern was wrong, and as the aircraft passed overhead, she could see it was a Taliban transport helicopter, probably bringing reinforcements to search for survivors. The enemy's quick response time and available resources confirmed her worst fears. This operation had been planned to be more than an ambush. It was designed to capture or eliminate an entire special operations team. The Taliban had invested significant resources and intelligence gathering into this trap. Maria pressed herself against a large boulder as the helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight sweeping the terrain below. The pilot was conducting a systematic search pattern, suggesting trained personnel rather than typical Taliban fighters. The enemy's sophistication continued to exceed expectations. When the helicopter moved away, she resumed her movement toward higher ground. The mountains would offer better concealment and multiple escape routes, but they also meant moving further from potential rescue. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and she was making them alone. Behind her, the compound continued to burn, sending a column of smoke into the night sky that would be visible for miles. The fire would draw attention from friendly forces, but it would also pinpoint the location where her team had been betrayed. Any rescue attempt would have to assume the area was heavily defended. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Maria found temporary shelter in a shallow cave. She had covered perhaps 3 miles from the compound, not enough distance to ensure safety, but far enough to avoid immediate detection. Now she needed to rest and plan her next moves carefully. The cave offered protection from aerial observation and a defensive position if enemy patrols found her location. More importantly, it gave her time to think through her situation without the pressure of constant movement. 6 hours until the rendezvous. If Thompson and the others had survived the initial ambush, they would be facing the same challenges she confronted: hostile terrain, superior enemy numbers, and the possibility that their extraction plans had been compromised from the beginning. The smart tactical decision would be to assume the worst and abandon the rendezvous entirely. But abandoning her teammates went against everything she had been trained to believe about military operations. No one gets left behind had been drilled into her since basic training. Yet staying alive long enough to help anyone required making smart decisions based on current reality rather than military idealism. If the Taliban knew about Checkpoint Alpha, approaching it could mean walking into another carefully planned trap. Maria checked her remaining supplies and weapon ammunition. She had enough for perhaps 2 firefights, assuming she could maintain the element of surprise. After that, survival would depend entirely on avoiding contact with enemy forces. The sun was rising, and with it came both opportunity and danger. Daylight would allow better navigation and threat assessment, but it would also make her visible to aerial searches and ground patrols. The next few hours would determine whether she lived or died in these hostile mountains. As she settled into the cave to wait out the daylight hours, Maria Santos began planning for a reality she had never expected to face: surviving completely alone in enemy territory while everyone who might rescue her believed she was already dead. The sound of approaching voices jolted Maria awake. She had dozed fitfully for perhaps 2 hours, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion despite the danger. Now, peering carefully from her cave hideout, she could see 3 Taliban fighters moving methodically up the mountainside, following what appeared to be her trail from the night before. Their search pattern was professional, not the haphazard sweep she might expect from typical insurgent forces. One fighter focused on tracks and disturbed ground, while the others maintained overwatch positions and communication with other search teams. These weren't village fighters. They were trained soldiers with military experience. Maria retreated deeper into the cave and checked her weapon. She had perhaps 30 rounds remaining in her primary magazine, with 2 additional magazines in reserve. Against 3 fighters, she might prevail if she could maintain the element of surprise, but gunfire would alert every enemy unit in the area to her exact location. The voices grew closer. Through whispered communications in Pashto, she could understand enough to know they had found signs of her passage. One fighter reported boot prints near the cave entrance, while another confirmed radio contact with the search coordinator. They were being thorough and methodical. Maria had to make a decision quickly: fight here and risk exposure to the entire search network, or try to escape deeper into the cave system and hope it provided another exit. She had no intelligence about the cave's depth or layout, but staying put meant almost certain discovery. The cave angled downward behind her, disappearing into darkness. Without proper equipment, exploring it was dangerous, but remaining at the entrance was suicide. She gathered her essential gear and began moving carefully into the deeper shadows. Behind her, she could hear the Taliban fighters approaching the cave mouth. Their conversation indicated they were debating whether to investigate or continue searching the mountainside. The decision might depend on how well she had concealed her entry. The cave proved deeper than expected, with multiple passages branching in different directions. Without light, navigation became a matter of touch and instinct. She followed what seemed to be the main passage, hoping it might connect to another entrance or at least provide a defensive position. After perhaps 15 minutes of careful movement, she detected a faint breeze carrying the scent of vegetation. The air current suggested another opening ahead, possibly leading back to the mountainside. If she could find it without alerting the search team, she might escape the immediate area undetected. The passage opened into a larger chamber with enough ambient light to suggest multiple openings. Maria could see 3 different tunnels leading away from the chamber, each potentially offering escape routes or death traps. Without reconnaissance, choosing the right path was pure guesswork. She selected the tunnel with the strongest air current, reasoning that airflow indicated connection to the surface. The passage proved narrow and difficult, requiring her to crawl in places, but it consistently angled upward toward what she hoped was daylight. Behind her, echoing through the cave system, she heard voices and the distinctive sound of boots on stone. The Taliban fighters had entered the cave and were conducting a systematic search. Their voices carried clearly in the confined space, and she could track their progress as they explored each passage. The tunnel she had chosen opened onto a narrow ledge on the mountain's opposite face, hidden from the original search area. Below her stretched a valley dotted with villages and cultivated fields, clearly populated territory where her presence would be quickly reported to Taliban forces. But the valley also offered opportunities. Where there were villages, there might be vehicles, communications equipment, and supplies. More importantly, populated areas sometimes harbored individuals who opposed Taliban control, people who might be willing to help an American soldier in exchange for future consideration. The challenge was reaching the valley without being spotted. The mountainside below the cave offered minimal cover, and daylight made movement visible from great distances. Any villager looking up would see her descent, and, in Taliban-controlled territory, reporting her presence would be both expected and rewarded. Maria studied the terrain carefully. A dry stream bed cut across the mountain face about halfway down, offering concealment for part of the descent. If she could reach it undetected, she might be able to follow it toward the valley floor while remaining hidden from casual observation. The descent required nearly 2 hours of careful movement. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet mountain air, and every loose stone that tumbled down the slope might alert someone to her presence. By the time she reached the stream bed, the sun was approaching its zenith, making further movement increasingly dangerous. The stream bed provided excellent concealment, but posed its own challenges. Recent rain had left standing water in pools along its length, forcing her to move slowly to avoid splashing sounds. More concerning, the bed showed recent signs of use by local herders, suggesting regular foot traffic. As she followed the watercourse toward the valley, Maria began encountering evidence of human activity: animal tracks, discarded items, and worn paths leading up the mountainsides toward grazing areas. She was entering inhabited territory where her presence could not remain secret for long. The sound of children's voices ahead forced her to take cover behind a boulder. Through careful observation, she could see 2 young boys driving goats along a path that intersected the streambed. They were perhaps 50 meters away, close enough to spot her if she moved carelessly. Waiting for them to pass seemed like the safest option, but as she watched, one of the boys stopped and pointed in her direction. Had he seen movement, or was he simply indicating something to his companion? Maria pressed herself against the stone and hoped her camouflaged uniform would blend with the rocky background. The boys approached her hiding spot, their conversation indicating curiosity rather than alarm. They were investigating something that had caught their attention, but she couldn't determine what had attracted their notice. If they discovered her, she would face an impossible choice: harm children or accept that her position would be reported to Taliban forces. One boy climbed up the bank of the streambed, moving directly toward her position. She could see his face clearly now, perhaps 12 years old, with the weather-beaten features of someone who spent his life outdoors. His eyes swept the area methodically, and she realized he was tracking something. Then, she saw what had attracted his attention: boot prints in the soft mud near the water. Her passage through the streambed had left clear traces that any experienced tracker could follow. The boy was reading the signs with the skill of someone raised in this environment. The second boy joined his companion, and together they examined the tracks. Their conversation was animated, but not alarmed. They seemed more curious than frightened. One pointed upstream, indicating the direction the tracks led, while the other gestured toward the village below. Maria faced a critical decision. These children would undoubtedly report what they had found, probably to their parents, who would then inform village elders. In Taliban-controlled areas, such information would quickly reach fighters who would organize immediate search operations. But harming children was absolutely unthinkable, and attempting to intimidate them into silence might backfire spectacularly. Her only realistic option was to abandon the streambed and find alternative concealment before the inevitable search began. As quietly as possible, she began moving away from her hiding spot, using the boulder as cover while the boys continued examining the tracks. Her movement needed to be immediate, but not sudden enough to attract attention through motion. The escape route she chose led up the opposite bank of the streambed toward a cluster of rocks that offered temporary concealment. From there, she could assess the terrain and plan her next moves. The key was creating distance before the alarm was raised. Behind her, the boys' voices indicated they had finished their examination and were moving on with their goats. But Maria knew the damage was done. Within hours, probably sooner, the entire area would be crawling with Taliban fighters following her trail. The rocky outcrop provided cover, but no long-term solution. She needed to put significant distance between herself and the streambed before enemy forces arrived. The problem was that any rapid movement across open terrain would be visible from the village below. As she considered her options, the sound of a motorcycle engine echoed across the valley. Through careful observation, she could see a rider leaving the village and heading up the mountain road toward the area where the children had been herding. The response was beginning faster than she had anticipated. The motorcycle was followed by a pickup truck carrying several armed men. Taliban forces were deploying with impressive speed, suggesting well-established protocols for responding to reports of foreign military presence. Her window for escape was closing rapidly. Maria chose a route that would take her higher up the mountain, away from the village and the approaching search teams. The terrain was harsh and offered little concealment, but it was better than being trapped in the lower areas where Taliban forces could easily surround her. The climb was punishing, especially with her still healing leg injury. Each step sent jolts of pain through her damaged limb, but stopping was not an option. Behind her, she could hear vehicles arriving and men organizing search teams. Voices carried clearly in the mountain air, and the tone suggested urgency and determination. After 2 hours of difficult climbing, she reached a ridge that offered views back toward the valley. The search operation below was extensive and well-organized. Multiple teams were working their way up different routes, while vehicles blocked potential escape paths. Overhead, she could hear aircraft circling, though she couldn't determine whether they were military helicopters or civilian spotters. The Taliban had committed significant resources to her capture, far more than seemed warranted for a single soldier. This suggested either that they believed she carried valuable intelligence, or that her capture had become a matter of prestige and propaganda value. From her elevated position, Maria could see the search pattern developing below. The Taliban were conducting a professional sweep operation, methodically checking each potential hiding place while maintaining communication between teams. They had learned from previous encounters with American Special Operations Forces. More concerning was the arrival of additional vehicles from neighboring villages. Word of her presence was spreading, and local Taliban commanders were pooling their resources for the search. What had begun as a localized pursuit was becoming a major operation involving dozens of fighters and extensive equipment. The rendezvous point with her teammates was now clearly impossible to reach. Even if Thompson and the others had survived the initial ambush, approaching Checkpoint Alpha would mean walking into the middle of the largest Taliban operation the region had seen in months. Maria had to accept the reality that she was completely on her own. No rescue was coming, and her teammates were either dead or facing similar impossible situations. Survival now depended entirely on her own skills and the choices she made over the next few hours. The mountain stretched endlessly in every direction, offering both salvation and death. Somewhere in that hostile landscape, she would either find a way to reach friendly forces, or her bones would join those of countless other warriors who had underestimated Afghanistan's harsh realities. As the sun began its afternoon descent, casting long shadows across the valley, Maria Santos prepared for the next phase of her survival ordeal. The Taliban forces below were getting closer, their search pattern tightening with each passing hour. Soon, she would have to move again, deeper into enemy territory, with no destination except away from immediate danger. The radio in her pocket remained silent, its circuits jammed or its frequencies compromised. Whatever communications her unit had established with higher command were severed, leaving her isolated in a way that no training had fully prepared her for. But Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had not survived the IED blast and months of rehabilitation to die alone in these mountains. Somewhere beyond the hostile peaks lay friendly territory and fellow soldiers who would never stop looking for missing personnel. Her job was to stay alive long enough for them to find her. The hunt was intensifying, but the hunted was far from defeated. The abandoned shepherd's hut appeared like a mirage after 8 hours of relentless climbing through treacherous mountain terrain. Maria's injured leg screamed with each step, but the small stone structure offered the first real shelter she had seen since escaping the cave system. More importantly, its location on a remote mountain pass suggested it might be forgotten by both locals and Taliban search teams. She approached the hut cautiously, weapon ready, scanning for any signs of recent occupation. The wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, and wind-blown debris had accumulated against the walls. Initial observation suggested abandonment, but Maria had learned not to trust first impressions in hostile territory. The interior revealed a single room with stone walls and a partially collapsed roof. Animal droppings indicated wildlife had claimed the space, but human artifacts were minimal and obviously aged. Most importantly, the hut's position offered commanding views of the valley approaches while being invisible from below. As Maria settled into the shelter, she conducted a realistic assessment of her situation. Water was becoming critical. Her remaining supply would last perhaps 12 hours at survival ration levels. Food was not yet urgent, but would become a factor within days. Medical supplies were adequate for minor injuries, but insufficient for any serious trauma. Most critically, her ammunition was limited to what she carried. After the Taliban forces found the hut, and they would eventually, her ability to defend herself would depend on choosing engagement opportunities carefully. Every round fired had to count. Through the hut's broken window, she maintained surveillance on the valley below. The Taliban search operation continued with impressive organization. Multiple teams were working systematically up different mountain approaches, while vehicles patrolled road networks to prevent her escape to lower elevations. What surprised her was the quality of their tactics. These weren't typical insurgent fighters conducting random sweeps. Someone with military training was coordinating the search, employing proper communication procedures, and maintaining disciplined search patterns. The Taliban had clearly learned from previous encounters with coalition forces. As afternoon faded toward evening, Maria began planning her next moves. Staying in the hut offered temporary safety, but guaranteed eventual discovery. The Taliban search was tightening methodically, and tomorrow they would begin checking structures like this one. Her best option appeared to be continuing higher into the mountains, toward terrain so hostile that even determined pursuers might be discouraged. But that route led away from any possibility of rescue and into areas where survival itself would become questionable. Alternatively, she could attempt to circle back toward lower elevations and try to slip through the Taliban's search network. This approach offered potential access to roads and communication lines that might facilitate escape, but it meant moving through areas where enemy presence was concentrated. Both options carried severe risks, and her decision would determine whether she lived or died in these mountains. There was no good choice, only degrees of desperate gambles. As darkness approached, the sound of approaching helicopter rotors interrupted her planning. The aircraft was flying a search pattern, using powerful spotlights to illuminate potential hiding places. The technology was more sophisticated than she expected Taliban forces to possess, suggesting either captured equipment or external support. Maria pressed herself against the stone wall as the helicopter passed overhead. Its searchlight swept across the mountainside, probing shadows and examining terrain features. The pilot was conducting a professional search, missing nothing that might conceal a hiding person. The light passed over the hut without stopping, suggesting her position remained undetected. But the helicopter would return, probably multiple times throughout the night. Each pass increased the risk of discovery, especially if ground teams were coordinating with aerial searches. After the helicopter moved away, Maria heard something that made her blood freeze. Voices approaching from down the mountain. Taliban fighters were climbing toward the hut, probably investigating the area the helicopter had illuminated. Their conversation indicated they were following a systematic search pattern, checking every structure and potential hiding place. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached the hut. Fighting them would alert every enemy unit in the area, but allowing them to search the structure meant certain capture. Neither option offered acceptable odds of survival. Maria gathered her essential equipment and prepared to abandon the shelter. Her only chance was to escape before the search team arrived, using darkness to mask her movement. The terrain behind the hut was steep and treacherous, but it offered the only route away from immediate danger. As she slipped out through the hut's rear wall through a gap in the stones, she could hear the Taliban fighters getting closer. Their voices carried clearly in the still mountain air, and their flashlight beams swept methodically across the rocky ground. These were experienced soldiers conducting a thorough search. The escape route led across a narrow ledge with a significant drop on one side. In darkness, each step risked a fall that would end everything instantly. But moving slowly increased the chance that the search team would spot her before she reached cover. Maria chose speed over safety, trusting her boots to find purchase on the uncertain footing. Behind her, she could hear the Taliban fighters reaching the hut and beginning their investigation. Voices indicated they had found signs of recent occupation, probably disturbed dust or other traces of her presence. The ledge ended at a cliff face that offered handholds leading upward into deeper darkness. Climbing at night was extremely dangerous, but the alternative was being trapped on the ledge when the search team expanded their perimeter. As she climbed, Maria could hear increased activity below. The Taliban fighters had definitely found evidence of her presence and were calling for additional support. Radio chatter indicated they were requesting aerial assets and more ground teams for expanded search operations. The cliff proved higher than expected, requiring nearly an hour of difficult climbing before she reached a stable position. Her injured leg throbbed constantly, and she could feel warm moisture inside her boot that suggested the wound had reopened under stress. From her new position, she could see the search operation below expanding rapidly. Additional vehicles were arriving, and multiple teams were spreading out to cover wider areas. Flashlight beams and searchlights created a constellation of threat indicators across the mountainside. Most concerning was the arrival of what appeared to be a command vehicle with sophisticated communication equipment. The Taliban were treating her capture as a high-priority operation, committing resources that suggested coordination with regional commanders. Maria realized that her situation had evolved beyond simple evasion of local forces. She was now the target of a major Taliban operation that would continue until she was captured or confirmed dead. The enemy had invested too much prestige and resources to abandon the search easily. The command vehicle's arrival also suggested that word of the failed mission had spread beyond immediate operational areas. Higher-level Taliban commanders were taking personal interest in capturing survivors from the ambushed American team. This development had both positive and negative implications. Increased Taliban focus meant greater immediate danger, but it also meant that American intelligence services would eventually detect the unusual enemy activity. Large-scale Taliban operations generated communication signatures that coalition forces could monitor and analyze. The question was whether help would arrive before her capture or death. American Special Operations protocols included provisions for personnel recovery, but those procedures assumed communication with missing personnel or reliable intelligence about their location. Maria had no way to signal her position or condition. Her radio remained useless due to jamming, and she carried no emergency beacons that might penetrate the electronic interference. From the American perspective, she was simply missing in action, possibly dead. As she planned her next moves, Maria heard an unexpected sound, the distinctive rotor signature of American helicopters in the distance. The sound was faint but unmistakable. UH-60 Black Hawks approaching from the direction of coalition bases. Hope flared briefly before reality reasserted itself. The helicopters were probably conducting search patterns based on the original mission parameters, looking for survivors near the ambush site. They would have no reason to search this far from the compound where her team had been betrayed. Moreover, approaching the helicopters would require moving back through areas now swarming with Taliban forces. Even if she could signal the aircraft, reaching a landing zone would be virtually impossible given enemy presence throughout the valley. The helicopter sounds faded as the aircraft continued their search in other areas. Maria was left with the bitter knowledge that rescue forces were operating nearby, but had no way to locate her position. As the night deepened, temperatures began dropping toward levels that would become dangerous without proper shelter. The mountains offered no protection from the elements, and her clothing was designed for tactical operations rather than extended wilderness survival. Hypothermia would become a threat within hours if she couldn't find adequate shelter. But every structure in the area would be searched by Taliban teams, and remaining in the open would eventually result in death from exposure. Maria decided to continue climbing toward higher elevations, gambling that the Taliban would be reluctant to pursue her into the most hostile terrain. The mountain's upper reaches offered minimal survival prospects, but they might provide temporary refuge from immediate pursuit. The climb proved exhausting and dangerous. Loose rock made every step treacherous, and the thin air at altitude left her gasping with exertion. Her injured leg finally gave out completely, forcing her to rely primarily on upper body strength to continue ascending. By dawn, she had reached an altitude where sparse vegetation and rocky terrain offered some concealment from aerial observation. More importantly, the difficulty of reaching her position might discourage all but the most determined pursuers. From her elevated vantage point, Maria could see the full scope of the Taliban's search operation. Multiple teams were working their way up different approaches, while aircraft conducted systematic sweeps of potential hiding areas. The enemy had committed impressive resources to her capture. But she could also see something else, smoke rising from a distant valley that suggested the presence of a coalition forward operating base. The facility was perhaps 15 kilometers away across extremely hostile terrain, but it represented the first concrete destination she had identified since the mission began. Reaching the base would require crossing multiple Taliban-controlled areas and surviving in hostile territory for days without adequate supplies. The odds were overwhelmingly against success, but it was the first realistic hope she had encountered. As the sun climbed higher, Maria Santos began planning what would either be her escape to safety or her final march through Afghanistan's unforgiving mountains. Below her, Taliban forces continued their methodical search, unaware that their quarry was already planning to slip through their closing net. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time since the ambush, Maria had identified a potential path to survival. Whether she possessed the strength and skill to follow that path remained to be determined, but she was no longer simply running from death. Now she was running toward life. The old man appeared without warning, materializing from behind a rock outcropping as silently as a ghost. Maria's finger found her weapon's trigger before her mind fully processed what she was seeing. A weathered Afghan herder, perhaps 70 years old, carrying a traditional walking stick and showing no apparent fear of the heavily armed American soldier pointing a rifle at his chest. For several heartbeats, they stared at each other across the narrow mountain path. Maria's tactical training screamed to eliminate the threat immediately. Any local who discovered her position would inevitably report it to Taliban forces. But something in the old man's eyes stopped her from taking that irreversible step. He spoke quietly in accented English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to respect. "American soldier, you are far from your friends." The fact that he spoke English was startling enough. The calm way he assessed her situation was even more surprising. This wasn't a frightened villager stumbling across a hidden enemy. This was someone who had been deliberately searching for her. Maria kept her weapon trained on him while considering her options. Killing an elderly civilian would violate every principle she had sworn to uphold, but allowing him to leave could result in her immediate capture. Neither choice was acceptable. "You are wounded," the old man continued, gesturing toward her leg where blood had seeped through her uniform. "And you have been running for 2 days without rest. The Taliban search for you with many men, but they search in wrong places." His assessment was accurate enough to be disturbing. How could he know details about her condition and movements unless he had been tracking her? The possibility that this encounter was planned made the situation even more dangerous. "My name is Ahmad," he said, settling onto a nearby rock as if they were having a casual conversation instead of a potential life-or-death confrontation. "I was teacher in Kabul before the wars. Now I tend goats in these mountains and watch Taliban make same mistakes as Russians as British before them." Maria maintained her defensive position while processing this information. The old man's educated speech patterns and historical references suggested genuine background in education, but that didn't necessarily make him trustworthy. The Taliban often used sophisticated approaches for gathering intelligence. You seek the coalition base in Khost Valley, Ahmad continued, again demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible to possess. But the route you plan will take you through 3 Taliban checkpoints and across terrain where they expect you to travel. The accuracy of his assessment was unnerving. Maria had indeed been planning to move toward the smoke she had observed, which probably did indicate a coalition facility. But she had told no one about her intentions, and her route planning had been done entirely in her head. "How do you know what I'm planning?" she asked, her first words since the encounter began. Ahmad smiled with genuine warmth. "Because I've seen many soldiers try to escape these mountains, and they all think the same way. Go toward the smoke, follow the valleys, avoid the high places." Taliban know this too. They wait where soldiers think they should go. The old man's logic was disturbingly sound. Her tactical training had indeed led her to plan a route based on standard military principles. Move toward known friendly positions, use terrain features for concealment, avoid unnecessary exposure. But if enemy forces understood those principles, they could predict her movements. "There's another way," Ahmad said, standing slowly and shouldering his simple pack. Longer, more difficult, but Taliban do not watch because they think no one would be foolish enough to attempt it. Maria faced a critical decision with insufficient information. Trust this mysterious stranger who claimed knowledge of secret routes, or continue alone using tactics that might be anticipated by enemy forces. Both options carried enormous risks. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Ahmed's expression darkened with old pain. "Taliban kill my son because he taught girls to read. They burn my school because knowledge threatens their control. I'm too old to fight with weapons, but I can still choose which side wins." The emotion in his voice seemed genuine, but Maria had been warned about sophisticated Taliban deception operations. Enemy forces had recruited villagers to pose as helpful civilians while actually leading coalition personnel into ambushes. However, her current situation was desperate enough that any alternative deserved consideration. The Taliban's search net was tightening systematically, and her original escape plans were probably compromised. If Ahmad was offering a viable alternative, refusing might be more dangerous than accepting. "Show me," she said, lowering her weapon slightly while maintaining readiness to use it instantly. Ahmad nodded and began walking along a path that seemed to lead deeper into the most inhospitable terrain visible. "We go up first, then ease through places where even goats struggle to find footing. Taliban think American soldiers too soft for such hardship." The route he indicated was genuinely intimidating, rocky, steep, and offering minimal cover from aerial observation. But those same characteristics might make it invisible to enemy forces focused on more logical escape routes. As they climbed, Ahmad maintained a pace that seemed impossible for his apparent age. His knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths for decades. Every few minutes, he would pause to listen and observe, checking for signs of danger with practiced skill. "You are special forces," he observed after an hour of silent climbing. "But not like others I've seen. You move like someone who has been hurt and must be careful." His assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Maria's still healing leg injury was affecting her movement patterns in ways she thought were subtle, but Ahmad had detected the compensation immediately. "IED blast 3 months ago," she admitted, unsure why she was sharing personal information with a stranger. Perhaps it was the relief of speaking to someone who showed no hostility, or maybe exhaustion was affecting her judgment. Ahmad nodded gravely. "The land remembers every explosion, every drop of blood. These mountains have seen too much of both. But they also remember acts of courage and kindness. Perhaps yours will be among them." They climbed through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers with proper equipment. Ahmad somehow found paths through seemingly impossible rock formations, always moving higher and further from areas where Taliban forces might patrol. As afternoon faded toward evening, they reached a plateau hidden among towering peaks. The location offered dramatic views of multiple valleys while being invisible from below. More importantly, it contained a small cave system that could provide shelter and defensible positions. "We rest here tonight," Ahmad announced, leading her toward the largest cave entrance. "Tomorrow we continue east, then down through the Serpent's Path to reach the old trade routes. From there, 3 days to coalition territory." The cave was larger and more comfortable than her previous hiding places, with evidence of occasional use by travelers. Ahmad quickly gathered materials for a small, smokeless fire that would provide warmth without visible signatures. As they settled for the evening, Maria began questioning her guide more systematically. His answers revealed extensive knowledge of regional geography, tribal politics, and military operations spanning decades of conflict. He spoke of Soviet operations with personal experience, coalition tactics with detailed observation, and Taliban strategies with intimate familiarity. "You seem to know everyone's methods," Maria commented. Ahmad stirred the fire carefully before responding. "In war, knowledge keeps you alive. I have watched armies come and go while mountains remain unchanged. Soldiers think their mission is most important thing, but mountains only care about survival." His philosophy was pragmatic rather than political, focused on endurance rather than ideology. This perspective might make him reliable, or it might make him willing to switch sides based on circumstances. "The Taliban search will continue for perhaps 1 week," Ahmad continued. "They have committed significant resources and reputation to capturing you. But they search from emotion, not logic. Emotion makes poor strategy in mountains." As night deepened, Maria found herself relaxing slightly for the first time since the ambush. The cave offered genuine security, and Ahmed's presence provided the first human contact she had experienced since losing her team. But trust came slowly after betrayal. Someone with access to classified information had provided the Taliban with detailed intelligence about her team's mission. Until she understood who could be trusted, suspicion was the only prudent response. "Tell me about the route you're planning," she requested, testing whether Ahmad would provide details that could be verified or contradicted by her own tactical knowledge. Ahmad produced a hand-drawn map from his pack, sketching additional details by firelight. His route avoided all known roads and settlements while utilizing natural terrain features for concealment. Most importantly, it approached coalition territory from an unexpected direction that would minimize Taliban surveillance. The plan was sophisticated enough to suggest genuine military understanding, but it could also represent an elaborate trap designed to lead her into a carefully planned ambush. Without independent verification, she could only evaluate Ahmed's proposal based on internal consistency and tactical logic. Both tests supported his credibility. The route made tactical sense, avoided obvious danger areas, and utilized terrain features effectively. An enemy deception operation might create an elaborate plan, but they would probably include subtle flaws designed to lead her into specific trap locations. "How do you know the coalition will be in that area?" Maria asked. Ahmad smiled again. "Because I helped them establish supply routes 6 months ago. American engineers paid well for information about paths trucks could travel. They remember promises to people who helped them." This detail was both encouraging and concerning. If Ahmad had previous positive contact with American forces, it suggested genuine pro-coalition sympathies. But it also meant the Taliban might be aware of his activities and could be using him for their own purposes. "We sleep now," Ahmad announced, banking the fire to glowing coals. "Tomorrow begins 3 days of hardship that will test whether American soldiers are truly as tough as mountains." As Maria settled into her sleeping position, weapon within easy reach, she reflected on the dramatic change in her circumstances. 12 hours earlier, she had been alone and hopeless, facing certain capture or death. Now she had a guide offering specific knowledge and a concrete plan for reaching safety. Whether that change represented salvation or a more sophisticated form of doom remained to be determined. But for tonight, she was warm, sheltered, and no longer completely alone in hostile territory. The old teacher who had lost everything to Taliban ideology had offered her something precious: hope. Whether that gift was genuine or poison would be revealed over the next 3 days as they traveled through terrain too hostile for deception to survive. Ahmed's breathing soon settled into the rhythm of deep sleep, suggesting either complete confidence in their security or masterful acting ability. Maria remained alert longer, listening to night sounds and processing the day's unexpected developments. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and force new decisions about trust, survival, and the price of hope in a landscape where betrayal carried deadly consequences. But tonight, for the first time since the ambush, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos dared to believe she might see home again. The radio crackled to life at exactly 0600 hours, 3 days after Maria had left the cave with Ahmad. Captain Jake Morrison of the 75th Ranger Regiment nearly dropped his coffee when he heard the transmission coming through on emergency frequency that had been silent since the failed mission. Any coalition station, this is Raven 6-4 requesting immediate extraction. Authentication code Whiskey 7 Alpha. Morrison grabbed the radio handset, his heart racing. Raven 6-4 was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, officially listed as missing in action after her team's ambush 72 hours earlier. Intelligence reports indicated the entire team had been killed or captured, but standard protocols required maintaining monitoring watches on all emergency frequencies. Raven 6-4, this is Falcon Base. Authenticate Bravo 2-2. Morrison responded, using challenge codes that would verify the speaker's identity. Falcon Base. Authentication is November 5 Charlie 6. Request immediate extraction from Grid 42S MD 847 193. Single friendly, wounded but mobile. Enemy presence unknown in immediate area. Morrison checked the authentication codes while his communications sergeant traced the radio signal. Both confirmations were positive. They were definitely in contact with Maria Santos, and she was transmitting from a location approximately 8 kilometers from Falcon Base. Within minutes, Morrison had alerted the base commander and initiated emergency extraction protocols. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were spinning up while a quick reaction force prepared for potential combat operations. After 3 days of unsuccessful searches, they had found their missing soldier. But the location Maria was transmitting from created significant challenges. Grid coordinates placed her in mountainous terrain controlled by Taliban forces, and recent intelligence indicated heavy enemy activity in that area. Extracting her would require flying into potentially hostile airspace while operating near the limits of helicopter performance at altitude. Raven 6-4, be advised extraction will require approximately 30 minutes due to terrain and threat assessment. Can you maintain current position? Maria's response carried fatigue and pain, but also determination. Falcon Base position is defensible but exposed to aerial observation. Will maintain until extraction arrives. Be advised I've been assisted by friendly civilian who provided route guidance. The mention of a civilian assistant raised immediate red flags for Morrison. Standard protocols treated all local civilians as potentially hostile, and enemy forces were known to use civilians for deception operations. Maria's reference to friendly civilian could indicate anything from genuine local assistance to sophisticated enemy manipulation. Raven 6-4 describes civilian contact and current threat assessment. Falcon Base, civilian is elderly Afghan male, claims former educator with pro-coalition sympathies. Provided route guidance through terrain, avoiding enemy patrols. Currently observe no immediate threats, but area has significant Taliban presence. Morrison faced a classic dilemma: trust his soldiers' field assessment of local civilian help, or assume potential enemy deception that could compromise the extraction operation. Maria was trained to evaluate such situations, but exhaustion and desperate circumstances might affect her judgment. The extraction helicopters were airborne within 20 minutes, flying low-level routes designed to minimize exposure to potential enemy fire. Morrison accompanied the flight as mission commander, bringing additional medical personnel in case Maria's injuries were more serious than her radio transmissions indicated. As they approached the extraction zone, Morrison could see why Maria had chosen the location. The landing site was a narrow mountain meadow surrounded by rocky terrain that offered excellent defensive positions. More importantly, it was located in an area that would be difficult for Taliban forces to reach quickly. But the site also presented significant challenges for helicopter operations. High altitude reduced aircraft performance, and the narrow landing area offered minimal margin for error. Worse, the surrounding peaks could easily conceal enemy positions equipped with rocket-propelled grenades or heavy machine guns. Raven 6-4, Falcon Base is 2 minutes out. Designate landing zone and confirm area security. Through binoculars, Morrison could see a figure emerge from concealment near the proposed landing site. The person was wearing military camouflage and moved with recognizable tactical awareness, but distance made positive identification impossible. Then, a second figure appeared, an elderly man carrying what appeared to be a walking stick. The civilian Ahmad whom Maria had mentioned was present at the extraction site, creating additional security concerns for the helicopter crews. Falcon Base, LZ, is secure. Friendly civilian will remain at distance during extraction. Ready for pickup. The lead helicopter descended carefully into the confined space while the second aircraft maintained overwatch. Morrison could see Maria clearly now. She was moving with obvious difficulty due to leg injuries, but she appeared alert and combat-ready. As the helicopter settled into the narrow landing zone, Maria approached at the fastest pace her injuries allowed. The elderly civilian remained at a respectful distance, not attempting to approach the aircraft or interfere with extraction procedures. Morrison leaped from the helicopter to assist Maria's boarding, immediately noting the extent of her injuries and exhaustion. She had lost significant weight. Her uniform was torn and stained, and her left leg showed signs of serious trauma, poorly treated with field expedient methods. "Good to see you, Sergeant," Morrison shouted over the rotor noise. "Let's get you home." As they helped Maria into the helicopter, she turned toward the civilian who had guided her to safety. Ahmad stood perhaps 50 meters away, watching the extraction with obvious satisfaction, but making no moves that could be interpreted as threatening. "What about him?" Morrison asked, indicating the elderly man. Maria looked back at her unexpected savior, then made a decision that would affect both their lives. "He saved my life, Captain. The Taliban will kill him if they discover he helped me. We can't leave him behind." Morrison faced a split-second decision with potentially significant consequences. Bringing an unvetted civilian to a coalition base violated multiple security protocols, but abandoning someone who had assisted a coalition soldier went against both military ethics and practical considerations for future local cooperation. "Bring him," Morrison decided. "We'll sort out the details on the ground." Through shouted communication and hand signals, they conveyed the invitation to Ahmad. The old man's face showed surprise and gratitude as he understood that he was being offered refuge from Taliban retribution. As both helicopters lifted off from the mountain landing zone, Morrison reflected on the mission's unexpected conclusion. They had not only recovered a missing soldier, but had also identified a local civilian willing to risk his life to assist coalition forces. During the flight back to base, Maria provided initial debriefing information about her survival ordeal and Ahmed's assistance. Her account painted a picture of sophisticated enemy tactics and organization that exceeded previous intelligence assessments, but also revealed potential local support that could be valuable for future operations. Ahmad remained quiet during the flight, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from mountain shepherd to coalition base refugee. But his eyes showed keen intelligence as he observed helicopter systems and crew procedures, confirming Maria's assessment that he was far more sophisticated than his appearance suggested. The medical evaluation at Falcon Base revealed the full extent of Maria's injuries and the harsh conditions she had endured. Severe dehydration, infected wounds, and malnutrition indicated that she had been near the limits of survival when Ahmad found her. More importantly, her debriefing provided crucial intelligence about the sophistication of the enemy ambush that had destroyed her team. The level of coordination and inside knowledge indicated a security breach that required immediate investigation by counterintelligence personnel. Someone fed them our entire operational plan, Maria told intelligence officers during her formal debriefing. They knew our routes, timing, and extraction procedures. This wasn't lucky timing or good enemy reconnaissance. The implications were sobering. A successful enemy penetration of coalition operational security had resulted in the loss of an entire special operations team. Only Maria's survival and Ahmed's assistance had prevented the enemy from achieving complete success. Ahmed's separate debriefing revealed extensive knowledge of Taliban operations and local politics that proved valuable for ongoing intelligence requirements. His background as an educator and his motivation for assisting coalition forces provided credibility for information that significantly enhanced understanding of enemy capabilities. Over the following weeks, both Maria and Ahmad would contribute to investigations that ultimately identified the source of the security breach and led to improvements in operational security procedures. But that evening, as Maria received proper medical treatment and Ahmad was provided temporary quarters on the base, the immediate crisis was over. The mission that had begun as a simple intelligence-gathering operation had cost 3 American lives and revealed serious security vulnerabilities. But it had also demonstrated the courage of individual soldiers and the potential for cooperation with local civilians who shared coalition objectives. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had proven that even when abandoned in hostile territory, properly trained soldiers could survive through determination, adaptation, and sometimes unexpected assistance from those who valued freedom over fear. Ahmad had proven that even under Taliban control, Afghanistan contained individuals willing to risk everything to help those fighting for principles they believed in. His assistance had saved Maria's life, but it had also provided coalition forces with invaluable intelligence and a reminder that their mission had local support. As Maria settled into her first secure sleep in days, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from ambush victim to survivor to rescued soldier. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested her limits and found her strong enough to endure what should have been impossible. The old teacher who had lost his school but retained his principles had given her more than guidance through hostile terrain. Ahmad had given her hope at the moment when hope seemed lost, and that gift had made all the difference between death and survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the military justice system investigated the betrayal that had cost American lives. But tonight, both Maria Santos and Ahmad were safe within the protective perimeter of Falcon Base, having proven that courage and compassion could triumph even in the harshest circumstances. The Taliban had failed to achieve their objective despite overwhelming advantages and inside information. Special forces had demonstrated once again that individual excellence could overcome superior numbers and hostile terrain when properly applied. Most importantly, the operation had revealed that even in the darkest corners of enemy-controlled territory, there were still people willing to choose hope over fear, principle over survival, and courage over surrender. The war would continue, but this battle had been won by the simple human decision to help those in need, regardless of the personal cost or political consequences. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where empires had foundered and armies had died, a wounded soldier and an elderly teacher had written another chapter in the endless story of human resilience and the power of unlikely alliances forged in desperate circumstances.